On the morning of July 27, 1377, city officials in the Croatian town of Ragusa had simply had enough. The bubonic plague, or Black Death, had decimated much of Europe and had brought the port town to its knees. A new rule was firmly put into place. It decreed that anyone coming from a plague-infested area was to spend 1 month on a small island until they were deemed safe to enter Ragusa. No exceptions. Doctors had noticed how separating infected or suspected infected people from the general population had proven effective in limiting the spread of disease. This was the first known case of quarantine being used in a pandemic. Throughout history, the world had to deal with some incredibly destructive and resilient diseases and pandemics. These diseases jumped from continent to continent, killing millions of people and crippling economies. Just as we saw with COVID-19, people were forced to come up with measures to safeguard themselves from not just contracting something, but spreading the infection. What's interesting is that not a whole lot has changed in how people and authorities have dealt with deadly pandemics. From the Middle Ages right up until the 21st century, methods such as quarantines, social distancing, and wearing masks have all been very prevalent. And there has been some genuinely devastating pandemics dating back as long as records were kept during the Roman Empire. In the 1300s, the bubonic plague wreaked havoc across Europe, Asia, and Africa. From 1346 to 1353, an estimated 75 to 200 million people died from the disease. It's thought to have been spread by fleas from rats on ships. Between 1918 and 1920, the world was floored by a flu epidemic that killed upwards of 50 million people. This was a shocking pandemic with a mortality rate of up to 20%. In the first 25 weeks of the outbreak, around 20 million people around the world had died. In the late 1970s, the HIV/AIDS pandemic began to spread, claiming an estimated 36 million lives. Fatalities finally began to dip around the mid-2000s with more widespread availability of treatments and support. The recent COVID-19 pandemic brought the world and economy to the brink and upended life for all corners of the globe. Approximately 7 million have died from COVID-19, with new treatments and stronger immunities helping to stem the tide. Many of the measures we took to prevent the spread of recent pandemics are very similar to those by people hundreds of years ago. Let's look at exactly how people survived some of the worst calamitous pandemics of all time. We first looked at how quarantine was used to combat the Black Death in the 1300s. Coastal cities, in particular, were fearful of ships arriving with infected passengers. Rats were prolific on ships during the 14th century, and fleas transmitted the disease by jumping from rats onto humans. This led to quarantining, which proved to be effective in at least slowing down the spread of infection. Ships coming into Venice were forced to spend 40 days in the port before the crew could come ashore. And here's a fun little pandemic fact. The word quarantine actually comes from the Latin quarantena, meaning 40 days. Quarantining became a common practice around the world from then on, especially with ships suspected of carrying infected passengers. When the deadly Spanish flu broke out in 1918, a quarantine and social distancing policy were introduced by many city authorities around the world. Many major cities like New York were quicker than others to react. In the early stages of the flu epidemic, New York ordered people to stay inside whenever possible and for infected citizens to self-quarantine. This is thought to have helped restrict the number of sick people by as much as 30 to 50%. And just as we saw with COVID-19, the same methods of quarantining and social distancing were used by cities and countries across the globe. The city of St. Louis, for example, had managed to successfully keep its mortality rates to a minimum, with strictly enforced social distancing and canceling of events. But when public gatherings were once again allowed, the number of infected people skyrocketed, prompting the city to return to the harshest possible restrictions. At the time, these measures were called non-pharmaceutical interventions. They included closing schools, churches, and theaters and maintaining safe distances from others. Masks and facial coverings were encouraged, and people were instructed to take special care when indoors or in confined spaces. And in fact, social distancing specifically was arguably even more critical during the 1918 flu epidemic, as medical authorities had very little in the way of ventilators, antibiotics, and other aggressive treatments or preventions. Keeping populations apart for as much as possible was the best tool that they had. But the practice of social distancing and quarantine goes back throughout history as far as records are available. When the Black Death or bubonic plague was rampant throughout Europe in the 14th century, people began staying away from infected areas. Taverns and food stores implemented makeshift service windows into their walls so customers could pay and receive goods without having to actually interact in the same capacity. During the Italian plague from 1629 to 1631, Tuscany wine merchants came up with wine windows. This exact same practice was seen during the dark days of COVID-19 when some New York City bars created non-contact service windows for cocktails. If you need a margarita, you need a margarita. The Italian wine windows were still in operations during the COVID-19 pandemic. The city of Florence had at least 150 very usable windows, and cafes were able to crank out coffees and wines. During the days of the American expansion to the west, many Native Americans were severely affected by smallpox. With no previous exposure to the disease, their immune systems were extremely vulnerable, and entire tribes faced the risk of being wiped out. Tribal leaders would assess infected regions and move everyone on to safer pastures. Nevertheless, if you had shares in mask-making companies during COVID-19, there were some juicy earnings to be made. Again, it wasn't just the coronavirus pandemic that demanded the widespread use of masks. During the 1918 Spanish flu, medical experts advised people to wear masks whenever possible. Although they weren't 100% sure of the exact means of the disease being transmitted, they were reasonably confident that limiting exposure to others would be effective. In 1918, masks were compulsory in San Francisco. Anyone who failed to comply was met with fines and even imprisonment. Such was the fear of contracting the flu. During the bubonic plague in the 14th century, some doctors wore masks, believing that it was impure smells that were causing the disease. While this was slightly off the mark, wearing masks was an early sign that people made the connection between breathing in suspect air and becoming infected. Additionally, contrary to popular belief, people in the Middle Ages were also generally aware of the importance of washing hands. This seems to have been a common practice amongst most populations, dating all the way back to the Greek and Roman empires. Another measure to deal with pandemics has been promoting the circulation of fresh air. This was particularly important during the early 20th century when outbreaks of tuberculosis and influenza were taking a deadly toll. In the early 1900s, up to 450 American children were dying every day, leading city officials to look for solutions. Germany had experimented with open-air schooling to protect against the 1918 flu epidemic, and they actually found it to be reasonably successful. America soon jumped on board, and in 1918, over 130 cities had open-air schools. The reasoning was also that many children were coming from being cooped up in unsanitary homes, and they needed fresh air to fight against the risk of infection. This also coincided with many cities deciding to build public parks in city areas, giving their citizens the chance and space to mingle relatively safely. Washing hands all became basically mandatory during this period, and hand basins were often built into the entrances of homes, shops, and buildings. This allowed visitors to quickly wash their hands without trooping potential germs through the buildings. However, the most effective form of combating pandemics has always been quarantine and distancing. Even the annual flu vaccines weren't available until the 1940s, meaning authorities had basically relied on the largely successful method of controlling the movement of people. Through trial and error, these methods have become by far the best ways of responding to epidemics and pandemics. As for the future, how can we be better prepared? Certainly, several things we've learned during the COVID-19 pandemic should form the building blocks to work towards future protections. Acting quickly and decisively is crucial. Many countries and regions that failed to respond to outbreaks throughout history have paid a devastating price. Thorough tracking and testing are other vital practices in working towards being aware of and controlling possible threats. Stockpiling essential supplies should be something that all governments are working towards. Preventatives and treatments, ventilators, and protective items should all be available if an infectious disease breaks out. With modern lifestyles of increased urbanization and international travel, the likelihood of another serious disease spreading is very, and I dare say very, real. However, by being prepared and by being ultra-vigilant, history has shown us that we should hopefully stand a stronger chance next time.